to overwrite arrow. There you go.
All right.
I saw that. I love pictures.
So hey guys, for those of you who don't know, my name is Isaac Ricklemer, and today I will be talking about my ideas on the universe, specifically the Big Bang universe expansion, which I like to call Alpha Prime. I will get to that later. To start off, I think we're going to start off with Stephen Hawking and his whole discovery about how the universe started. The short version of this is that he believed if you keep on stepping back and back and back, eventually what you'll come to is something called a singularity. And for those of you who don't know, at the edge of a star's life, when it's about to die, if the core dies before the exoskeleton, thank you. If the core dies before the exoskeleton of the star, then the core starts to cool off and get smaller and smaller. And it eventually, if it does reach what I call an escape density, becomes so compact that gravity starts falling in on itself and the mass starts caving in on itself until it gets so small it just takes up one tiny spot in all of space-time, which is why it's called a singularity, a single point, a singularity. So let's take that and move forward. Stephen Hawking's The universe started from a singularity. And we're going to take this over to the Big Bang Theory. And what the Big Bang Theory basically states is that if you go back to the beginning, there was a whole bunch of something, and that something, for some reason we don't know, exploded and started expansion to all the universe. As you can probably assume, there's a lot of questions that don't quite get answered when you hear that. Like, where did everything come from? Why did it go boom? Why are we expanding, and why are we still expanding? And to the point where we can notice out in space, we're not just expanding, but everything in the universe is getting faster and faster away from each other at a faster and faster rate. So let's move on and start to break this down into a thought process. So if we're talking about Stephen Hawking, and he believes it came from a singularity, and Big Bang believes that everything came from this cluster of mass, which doesn't really seem like it's opposing each other, we can pretty much assume that Big Bang Theory is more or less thinking that Stephen Hawking's theory isn't so bad on the origin of everything, so a singularity. But my problem is we know where a singularity came from. It's at the edge of a star's life, as we discussed, is one possible situation where it can be formed. And so that also didn't sit well with me. So I started off with the concept of an incubating black hole, and I said, let's go down every type of black hole I can think of that actually would make sense to me. And again, this is just a theory, so if you believe it, great. If you don't, find another one that suits you better. But the first type of black hole we're going to talk about is an incubating black hole, which is kind of this situation over here. And so that singularity was formed, and this dot over here is where the singularity would be. And this is kind of the black hole area, and we're going to differentiate between those two. So we have the singularity, the actual piece of mass, and at the top in our universe we have the black holes, which is that point, the distance from the singularity to space in 4 dimensions, where we can no longer see where light escapes, which is why it's called a black hole, because light can no longer escape. Now, this is actually a predecessor for the next 2 types of black holes we're going to discuss. The next one being child black holes, which you can guess, if there's a parent, there's a child. And so what happens in this case is we have that incubating black hole, and it gestates and it builds and it grows and it becomes to the point where there's so much pressure and so much mass just shoved into this little tiny point in space that's fallen all the way down to the bottom of the fabric of space-time in a vortex formation. And so all of a sudden we have this expansion in my theory where the Big Bang gets set off because of this critical moment, and it starts expansion to a whole new universe. And that brings us to the last type of black hole type we're going to talk about, which is a sibling/bridge universe, and we got the siblings over there. And so the whole concept behind this one is it's similar to the child, but in this scenario there's multiple black holes or singularities in relative proximity in 4 dimensions, not 3 dimensions. So again, it's this type of distance. And so let's say if we had one here, and another one here, and another one here, so it could be 2 or more. then all of their masses are going to be attracted to each other, because we know how gravity works. The more mass you have in one area, the more it attracts to each other. Yes?
Are you saying the siblings are feeding the same cluster in the middle? Like, are they all feeding the same species?
So not quite. So imagine there's 3 of these rotated, right? Or 2 of them. Let's just take 2 of them, okay?
Yeah.
We have 2 of them in 2 different universes. And so the massive amounts of mass, they're close in 4-dimensional space, because we can't actually see the way it curves, so let's just call it 4-dimension and call it a day. But basically, these 2 masses will find each other because if they're going here, they'll naturally, because of gravity, align and start to stretch towards each other, right?
Yeah.
That's very intuitive. If you know anything about gravity, that's how it works. So once they meet each other, they would become cannibalistic, and they would envelop into a larger singularity or a larger black hole, whatever you want to think about it. And that would create, after a critical moment, it turns into what I call a bridge universe. And that is, assuming that we are able to travel through them, then we would be able to travel from the first universe through the bridge universe over to whatever other sibling universe was on the other side, right? So it connects those 2 with that in the middle. And so this still hasn't quite answered our question, where does everything come from? Because we've just discussed different types of black holes, and quite possibly how our universe was started, in my opinion. Because I don't personally believe we live in the original universe, but that's a whole different conversation. So, in the beginning, what was there? And so if we go keep on asking, what came before that, what came before that, eventually, you have to come to the conclusion that at least the very first time, there had to be something created from nothing. Would anyone like to disagree with that? No, it's pretty easy to assume the first thing ever created was nothing, or the first thing ever was nothing. Okay, awesome. Usually I go through a lot more issues on that one. And so at this point I was thinking, okay, we have all of this space, and I kept on asking, what happens? How do I go further back? And I realized this is a flawed question. The actual question I should be asking is what's present when nothing's there? And it was the funniest thing. Literally at 2 a.m. in the morning, I came up to this idea about almost 2 years ago, and out of nowhere, someone turned their vacuum on in a unit next to mine, and it was kind of like an epiphany moment. I started to laugh, thinking, it's a vacuum. When there's nothing, there's a vacuum. By definition, a vacuum is an area with no matter in it. It's void of any space. And so the problem is on Earth, and for mostly everything, all except for one of the vacuums are not natural. And technically black holes might count as a natural vacuum, but this isn't the type that I'm talking about. This type of vacuum would actually have something called a vacuum potential energy, and it's not just me who theorizes about this. In fact, I Google searched it and I found that there is a natural force called a vacuum potential energy everywhere in space, where it's basically pulling out from every direction, everywhere in empty space. And so I took this theory, but before I knew that it was a real thing, and I expanded on it, and I said, okay, well, let's think about it. We have nothing and we have a whole bunch of energy. So what can we do with that? And we come over to this concept. How did something turn into nothing? So we have 0 and we have energy, and we're going to get to this very, very simple formula. 0 plus energy is equal to 1 minus 1, or 1 plus negative 1, because nature doesn't know subtraction. And so this is the first stepping stone on our way to thinking what things happen. So on how everything actually started for the first time. So this is very important. 0 plus energy. So we have a whole bunch of energy, and we have a formula to use for it, a 1 plus negative 1. But what is the 1 plus negative 1? Well, it has to follow a few constraints. This was supposed to pop up second, I apologize. So the first constraint is it has to be the most reactive substance we know. And we know that just 3 grams of antimatter can get us from here to Pluto and back in a year, based on the amount of energy it produces. In fact, just 1 gram coming into contact with 1 gram of matter would explode and create an explosion so large it would be more powerful than 42 kilograms of TNT. So I don't know of anything that is more reactive than this, but I'm not going to eliminate it or anything, because at this point this is the most we know. And the second thing is, it has to be a building block for everything. And even if we break it down to atomic structures, we have protons in matter, and we have positrons made of antimatter. And the more you break it down, all of the classifications fall into types of matter and types of antimatter. So matter and antimatter do seem to be the likely candidates for what this 0 plus -1 is. So let's get a bit of an overview for what we talked about, starting from the beginning and seeing how it's going to expand out. At the beginning, there was nothing. All of a sudden, somehow, all of nothing turned into a vacuum, whether some rules got put in place or not. At that point in time, mass, matter, and antimatter started ripping out of the infinite energy that was, being produced by the vacuum, spanning infinite space. And so as all of this matter and antimatter is coming into creation, it flies in all different directions and creates massive amounts of explosions, because as we know, just 1 gram will create a giant explosion bigger than 42 kilograms of TNT. Imagine how much all of the creation of everything would create. It would send matter flying off into all directions. And whether there's clumps of matter and antimatter that are floating very close in weird orientations, the further you get away due to the survival of how these things work, because every time it explodes, it goes the other way, and so far on. Anytime it comes into contact, it gets destroyed. We'll end up further out into the reaches of space with clumps of just matter and clumps of just antimatter in weird orientations, and eventually it'll form stars and planets, and those will come to the end of their life, and once those come to the end of their life, they'll form black holes, which will feed into the future universes. And so I want to leave you guys with this question. What puts these laws of a vacuum in place? What greater power, in my opinion, was able to say there's nothing, and now this nothing is a vacuum, and because of the way a vacuum works, it can create infinite amounts of space. There has to be something more than just this, and I think that everything does come down to belief, and we are just here to observe and live life and contribute to society. So take everything with a grain of salt, and thank you so much for your time.